Hello and welcome. My name's Andy Crook, and my mission is to help garage owners become more successful in business. And how do I do that? I go live most weeks on a training topic from one of the 5 pillars of business as I see it. This week we're in the systems pillar, and this topic follows on from the last one. And last time we were talking about the pulse of the business. We talked about measuring what matters. Not guessing, not hoping. We talked about numbers. The numbers that tell you whether your business is healthy or just looks busy. So after you start measuring, then this week is the next step. This week is about patterns. Most garage owners don't have as many separate problems as they think. What they have is patterns. And if you can see the pattern, you can solve the problem. But if you don't see the pattern, you keep paying over and over again for the same lesson. And this is what often happens. An owner thinks about their business, and instead of studying the evidence, they just go with their gut. You hear them say things like, I reckon, I feel like, it seems to me, I think what's happening is, which isn't really good enough, because sometimes gut does not mean instinct. Sometimes gut means giving up thinking. And that means you stop looking, you stop studying, you stop searching for the signals, and you replaced evidence with emotion. And that's dangerous in business because your feelings are fast, but your figures are fair. Your mood will mislead you, but the measurements will mature you. And that is the shift today. Not from no data to data, but from data collected to data deciphered. So let me tell you a story about a garage owner. It might be a familiar story for some of you. They're hardworking, hands-on, helpful, head down and flat out. From the outside, things look great. The workshop is busy, the phones are ringing, the jobs are coming in. Everything looks productive. But underneath that, something's not sitting right. Cash feels tighter than it should. Certain jobs always seem to run over. And jobs that look decent at the start look disappointing by the end. So they do what many owners do. They start blaming the usual four: the market, the money, the method, the model. The market is too competitive. Money is too tight. The method isn't working, and the model is broken. And listen, sometimes they all play a part. Sometimes all four play a part. But when the same pains keep turning up week after week, month after month, that's not just pressure, that's a pattern. Now, these owners have been to a local networking event. You know the sort of thing: coffee, conversation, and a few business cards exchanged. You might even tell a few war stories. But in this instance, they met a business coach. Not a loud one, not a hype man, not a social media slogan machine, a calm bloke, a sharp bloke, the sort who listens, and after hearing the owner describe the business, says something simple. Something like, you already have the evidence, you're just not looking at it. You're still using your gut. And then he says, and half the time, gut just means giving up thinking. And that really struck a chord with them because it was true. They had the numbers. They had been measuring. They looked at invoice value per day, hours sold, gross profit. But they had still been reacting like someone with no evidence. Still going by feel. Still going by frustration. Still calling patterns one-offs. And the coach said, if you want the right customer at the right time for the right job, then stop staring at the business emotionally. Start reading the evidence. And that's the plan. Look at the data, read the patterns, and respond with a system. Look, read, respond. So the first step, the coach said, is stop using the data as a decoration. Start using it as evidence. So the data isn't decoration, the data is evidence. Because lots of owners measure the numbers. but then they never really look at them. They record them, they report them, they maybe even review them, but they don't read them. They do not ask, what is this data telling me? What is it that keeps repeating? What is the business trying to teach me? So the coach tells them to go back and look properly at 3 things he should already be measuring. And that is the 3 things we looked at last week. Invoice value per day, labour hours sold, and gross profit. He said that's enough. We don't need 50 KPIs. Not the dashboard overload, just 3, because those 3 will tell a story. They'll tell a story about timing, a story about overruns, and a story about margin. And once you read the story, you can stop relying on your gut and start relying on proof. The second step, the coach said, is don't just look at the numbers as numbers. Look at them as behaviours. And that's where this gets powerful, because the numbers are footprints. They show you where the business has been walking. And 3 patterns start to stand out. So once you start to see the patterns, you need to respond with a system. And this is when the coach said something absolutely brilliant. Once a pattern repeats, it deserves a process. That's systems thinking, not sympathy, system, not reaction, a response. Not let's try harder next week. No, if it repeats, it requires a response. So they build 3 separate systems. The first one is all to do with timing. The owner had been saying, cash flow feels tight. But when they looked at the evidence, they see something much more precise. The issue is not always how much work is being done. The issue is when the invoice is being created. Some days are strong and some days are weak, but the invoice is late all too often. Time pressure builds and things start to slip. And that matters because poor timing creates more pressure, and pressure creates poor decision. So poor timing creates the pressure, and pressure creates the poor decisions. So what looked like a cash flow problem is really a timing problem. Not just how much value was created, but when it was invoiced, and therefore when it was paid. This is a classic collection pattern disguised as cash flow. When we look at cash flow, we always consider the initials AC/DC, one of my favourite rock bands. And the AC is attract and convert, and the DC is deliver and collect. Now, it often looks like there's a delivery problem when sometimes it can be a collection problem. In this case, when they're busy, they don't always do the invoices in a timely fashion. The second pattern was overrun. When they looked at labour hours sold, things started to get a little bit uncomfortable. The jobs that always felt stressful are not random. They are repeat offenders. The same sorts of jobs keep running over. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly. And when they run over, 3 things happen. They create delay, they create disruption, and they create disappointment. Delay, disruption, disappointment. And that's the pattern. And once it happens, communication starts to slip. The customer hasn't been updated. The surprise arrives late. And when I mean the surprise, what I mean is the bill. They haven't told the customer things have gone wrong, and then the customer turns up expecting one price and is given another. And that's when the conversation gets awkward. And now the customer starts to look like a complainer. But often, they're not the cause. They are the consequence. A consequence of poor prediction, poor pricing, and poor preparation. Because if the last 10 of those types of jobs all ran over, then the 11th probably wasn't unlucky. It was part of a pattern. And patterns should be priced. And that's one of the big lines of this episode. Patterns should be priced. If the last 10 ran over, the next one needs more labour built in. Not because you are greedy, but because you are finally being honest. Honest with yourself, and honest with your team, and honest with the customer. You can dress it up however you like, But one of the ways you can do it to protect your relationship and keep that lines of communication open is to say, the last, however many you say, 4 or 5 of these we did, took longer than we expected because of, and then you can quote the cause, broken bolts, whatever it is. If that happens, we've built in a contingency. And then you can always tell the customer that it's going to take longer than you expect, therefore they get their car back sooner and possibly at a lower price. And the third pattern they discovered was a problem with margin. When they looked at gross profit, the story begins to sharpen again. Some of the jobs looked good in the diary. The workshop looked busy. It looked productive with lots going on. But it didn't produce enough gross profit. And that means they were not good, profitable jobs. They were just jobs. And there is a difference. Full does not always mean fruitful. Some work fills the ramps, but not the bank account. So what looked like we need more work was actually a margin pattern, not a volume issue, a value issue. Because low margin jobs hurt twice. First, they produce little return. And second, they steal time from better work. What I call opportunity cost. So finally, the owners could see it. What was happening wasn't random, it was repeated. A timing pattern, an overrun pattern, a margin pattern. All three were always there, sitting in the evidence, not in their feelings, but in the figures. So they started reviewing the invoice value per day properly, not casually, not occasionally, properly, because the goal is not just a busy week, the goal is a better week, a steadier stream of value, less drift, less delay, less pressure, because again, poor timing creates pressure, and pressure creates poor decisions. They discover they have a pattern of backloading the week. Too many jobs due out on Fridays, which creates the time pressure, results in them invoices being missed on the Friday. They're so busy trying to get the work out, they don't have time to do the invoicing. The solution is simple, a better booking system. Not everyone can or wants to collect their car on a Friday afternoon, but that's what's been happening. So they start to ask customers when they would prefer to collect their car and plan accordingly. When they start reviewing the last 10 similar jobs before pricing the next one, that lesson they learned, not what the book said, or not what they hoped it would take, what their history said it would take. If the last 10 all ran over, then the next one gets more labour built in, clearer customer communication, clearer checkpoints, and a better update process when the job changes shape. Now the work is being priced by pattern, not by optimism, by evidence, and not by ego. That's worth saying again, by evidence, not ego. Now they can give realistic timescales and quotes to customers. The result is less time pressure on the workshop. Customers are delighted when their vehicle is ready early and under budget, but never disappointed when it takes longer, because they've just been warned beforehand. Remember, the last 5 of these have all taken longer than expected because of that corroded fasteners, etc. When they started reviewing gross profit by type of work, not the number of invoices, not just the invoice value, not how busy, not measuring movement, not just whether the diary looked full, because full is easy, fruitful is much harder. Now they can ask better questions. Which jobs are actually good jobs? Which jobs are draining time and delivering weak margin? And which jobs create proper return? Which jobs only create movement? And slowly their filtering improves. They get the right customer at the right time for the right job. And they discover what their core offer is, their core job. And core stands for continuously optimizing revenue engine. This is often your highest income generating task. But what happens if they ignore these patterns, or any other patterns for that matter? Simple. The same pain keeps repeating. Poor timing creates pressure. Jobs keep running over, customers keep sounding difficult, and gross profit stays weak due to the wrong work. And because they never study the evidence, they keep renaming the same pattern. They call it a hard week, a difficult customer, a tricky month, just one of those jobs. But it is not any of those things. It is repeated behaviours without review. And that is exhausting, because when you do not study the evidence, you start sighing instead of solving. And this is an all too common story with garage owners. They endure what they should examine, and they repeat what they should review. And then they call it a hard week, a difficult customer, a tricky month, or just one of those jobs. But if they follow the plan, and they create processes and systems to address the patterns, the business starts to change. Not because the market suddenly got easier, not because every customer becomes perfect, not because every technician becomes more efficient overnight. No, none of those things. Because the owner became clearer. They stopped using their gut and they started thinking. They start looking, learning and leveraging. And they start linking the evidence to the outcome. And now they can see that cash pressure has a timing pattern. Overruns have a history, and complaints often come from poor communication after poor control. Weak gross profit is a warning that being busy isn't always better. And then the workshop starts to feel different. Calmer, clearer and cleaner. Not perfect, but more predictable. And predictable is powerful, because when the right things repeat, confidence grows. And that's what systems do. They take a lesson and they stop you paying for it twice. So here's the key takeaway from this week. This week's atomic action. If last week you started to measure the pulse of your business, this week you need to start observing the patterns. You need to look at one of those key performance indicators, whether that be invoice value per day, your labour hours sold, or your gross profit, and ask, what is the pattern? Is there a timing pattern? Is there an overrun pattern? Is there a margin pattern? And whatever you do, do not go with your gut, because in business, gut can mean giving up thinking. Go with the evidence, because patterns do not live in panic. They live in the paperwork. They live in the numbers. They live in the evidence. And when you read the evidence properly, the pattern starts talking. And when the pattern starts talking, the business starts teaching. And when the business starts teaching, you can stop paying tuition fees for the same lesson. Because remember this, patterns pay, but only when you pay attention. And if you should, you must, and what's probably stopping you is starting. See you next time.